So, in the decades right after the First World War, Europe was an absolute chaos. I mean, old empires were gone, economies were completely shattered, and everybody was looking for answers. This uncertainty created a perfect storm for the rise of powerful new leaders with some really radical ideas. Okay, let's dive into this dark and, frankly, transformative period.
And these words from Joseph Stalin himself really capture that revolutionary feeling. He's talking about a world completely turned on its head, where, for the first time, power was in the hands of everyday people who'd never had it before. But with the old rulers gone, a new question popped up. Who was going to fill that power vacuum, and how are they going to rule? That question? Well, it would define the next 20 years of European history.
So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with Stalin's ominous rise in the brand new Soviet state, and then we'll look at Mussolini's fascist blueprint over in Italy. From there, we'll go deeper into the Soviet power struggle and Stalin's iron grip. Then, we'll see how Spain's civil war basically became a dress rehearsal for a much bigger war. And finally, we'll see just how few democracies were actually left standing right on the brink of World War II.
All right, first up, Stalin's rise. I mean, how did a figure like him even become possible? Well, the answer really lies in the chaos that followed World War I and then the crippling Great Depression. It created this landscape of total disillusionment where people just lost faith in the old ways, opening the door for some radical new ideas about how a country should be run.
Think about that for a second. By 1939, across the entire continent of Europe, only two major powers were still democracies. The economic collapse was so devastating, when people saw their life savings just wiped out and their futures disappear, they got desperate. They started looking for strong leaders who promised order and national pride, no matter what it cost in personal freedom.
And this desperation gave rise to something new, the totalitarian state. This was a whole different level of control. It wasn't like the old monarchies that just demanded you obey. No, this was about conquering the minds and hearts of the people. It was about controlling not just what you did, but what you thought, through non-stop propaganda and forced participation.
And the first person to really build one of these modern dictatorships was Benito Mussolini in Italy. He literally wrote the playbook for European fascism, creating a model of control that other future dictators would be watching very, very closely.
So what is fascism at its core? To put it simply, the state is everything. The individual? You're basically secondary. All power gets centralized under one leader, one dictator, and any opposition is just crushed. It's a total rejection of democratic ideals.
But why Italy? Why there? While Mussolini was a master at tapping into this potent mix of fears and desires. The middle class was absolutely terrified of a communist revolution. A lot of Italians felt betrayed and cheated by the peace treaties after the war. And right in the middle of all that economic chaos, his powerful message of national pride and bringing back order was exactly what a lot of people wanted to hear.
So how did he actually pull off the takeover? It wasn't some overnight coup. He started with a political party. Then he used the threat of force, that famous March on Rome, which was just a masterful piece of political theater, to basically intimidate the king into making him prime minister. Once he was in, he dismantled democracy piece by piece, creating a secret police and outlawing all opposition until he was the undisputed leader, Il Duce.
Now, while Mussolini was busy building his fascist state in Italy, a totally different kind of totalitarian power was taking shape over in the East. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, a massive power vacuum opened up in the Soviet Union, and the future of the world's first communist state was hanging in the balance.
To really get this struggle, you have to understand the situation they were in. The country was on its knees. A brutal civil war and a horrifying famine had killed millions. Lenin, ever the pragmatist, saw they were headed for a cliff and pulled back. He brought in the new economic policy, which allowed for some private business, a shocking but temporary return to capitalist ideas just to keep the country from completely falling apart.
And this policy led to a huge split in the Politburo, the Communist Party's leadership. On one side, you had Leon Trotsky. He wanted to end the NEP, industrialize at lightning speed, and spread communist revolution around the world. On the other side was a group that wanted to keep the NEP going and focus on building socialism at home first. This was the ideological battlefield where Joseph Stalin was about to make his move.
You see, Stalin was an absolute master of political maneuvering. While everyone else was busy debating big ideas, he was quietly focused on accumulating power, putting his allies into key positions. In the end, he would outflank every single one of his rivals and launch the Soviet Union on a path of truly brutal transformation. And this timeline just shows you his methodical takeover. By 1927, his main rival, Trotsky, was out.
A year later, he scraps Lenin's policy and launches his super-ambitious 5-year plans to industrialize the nation practically overnight. And by 1934, he had forced almost all of Soviet agriculture under state control through this policy of collectivization.
And to cement his rule, he built this extraordinary cult of personality. This quote from an official hymn, it's just chilling. It shows how the propaganda was designed to replace everything, family, religion, any other loyalty, with just absolute, total devotion to Stalin, the so-called inspired leader.
And on paper, his industrial plan was a staggering success. In less than a decade, heavy machinery production quadrupled, and steel production just exploded. He was forging a superpower. But, and this is a huge but, this progress was built on a foundation of unimaginable human suffering. Let's talk about the human cost. Start with collectivization. It caused a famine that killed an estimated 10 million people. In Ukraine, this was known as the Terror Famine, and many see it as a deliberate act by Stalin to crush Ukrainian nationalism. And what about the workers, the ones building this new superpower? Well, even with the industrial boom, their real wages plummeted by 43%. They were literally building a new world on empty stomachs, sacrificing everything for the goals of the state. And the price for disagreeing? That was the Great Purge. Anyone even suspected of being disloyal, army officers, intellectuals, just ordinary citizens, was at risk. 8 million people arrested and sent to the Gulag labor camps. Most of them never came back. So as Stalin is solidifying his power, another conflict is exploding in Western Europe, and it served as a horrifying preview of what was to come. The Spanish Civil War became a literal battleground for the clashing ideologies of the time: fascism, communism, and democracy. It started as an internal revolt, but it went global fast. General Franco's forces got direct help from Mussolini and Hitler. In fact, Hitler used Spain as a live testing ground for his brand new air force, the Luftwaffe, which led to the horrific bombing of the civilian city of Guernica. On the other side, the Spanish Republic got help from the Soviet Union and thousands of international volunteers. It really was a proxy war for the soul of Europe.
So let's pull back one last time and just look at the big picture. By the late 1930s, the political map of Europe had been completely redrawn. All that optimism from the 1920s was gone, replaced by a continent dominated by authoritarian rule.
And this table just shows you the stark reality. You've got the democracies, now a tiny handful of nations like Britain, France, and Czechoslovakia, basically huddled together. And they are surrounded by aggressive fascist and Nazi states, the massive communist Soviet Union, and a whole block of other authoritarian regimes. Democracy wasn't the norm anymore, it was the exception.
And that leaves us with the final unavoidable question. Looking at this landscape, with these totalitarian powers armed with new weapons and ideologies bent on expansion, and with democracy in full retreat, the question really wasn't if another great war would come, but when. The stage was well and truly set for a global catastrophe.